Hello, everyone, and welcome back to HeirKare with Kathleen and Erik. We are estate planning attorneys in Johnson City, Tennessee, and Suwanee, Georgia. And this week we are talking to you about estate planning for business owners. Business owners of all different shapes and sizes have different concerns when it comes to how to address estate planning concerns and succession planning for their business, either small or large. And so today we're going to talk to you about some things to keep an eye out for and some things to think about and some stories that we have come across in our practice. The first thing we want to talk about is when you come to an estate planning meeting and you are a business owner, you should absolutely bring with you your organizational documents, whether those are bylaws, an operating agreement, a shareholder agreement, whatever you have titled yours. It will be very, very helpful if you go ahead and bring that to the meeting with you. So Erik, and Erik is our business and tax planning guru. He loves all things in this area. And so Erik, why don't you tell us, once we show up at a meeting with our documents, tell us about some of the concerns and the things that you address in those meetings.
So in that meeting, there's kind of a couple main points that I'm looking to make sure that we at least touch on and talk about. One is, as you mentioned, succession for the business. How are we going to hand that off? What's the plan? What's in the business owner's mind? What's the plan? Is it to pass it to an employee? Is it to pass it to a kid? Is it to sell at some point? There's lots of options there. Then the other piece is, what kind of plan are we doing as an estate plan, and how do we make sure that the business is actually factored into that and covered by whatever documents we do? Then next piece is going to be, how are we making sure that money is flowing to the estate at the end of this thing? Is it going to be through business income? Is it going to be through a buyout of the business? And then a real practical one is just, how do we make sure that this business actually operates? If the business owner ends up not involved due to incapacity or due to their death, how do we make sure this thing keeps going long enough to actually be worth something? And so those are kind of the big ones that we talk about. Every situation comes up with some just weird spots here and there that we kind of deal with the specifics, but those are kind of the four broad categories of discussions and decisions that we make. So, Kathleen, why don't you start us off with, and I know you like to talk like I'm the only one that knows business stuff in the firm, but you do handle business things too. And so, if we start from just sort of the most basic, we've got a sort of single shareholder, single member LLC that's really, they're running things on their own. They don't have employees. They just have maybe some rental properties or some things, but they do have it all set up into an entity that is running and operating. How do we include that in our estate plans that we do?
So very often in these situations, we are looking at putting a revocable trust into place. And one of the things we like to do in conjunction with that is to go ahead and name the trust as the member of the LLC, which means that whoever starts that trust is the initial trustee, but if they become unable to manage it, there's already a successor trustee named. The assets are already in the name of the trust, so that successor trustee can then step into the position to take care of the rental assets, the LLC assets, along with whatever assets are in the trust's name. So that's how we handle things at a really basic level. Erik, why don't you give us an idea on some of the things we might look at if we have a little more complex of a business situation?
Yeah, so the next level beyond that is going to be that we've got employees, or we've got a sort of outward facing business, a retail store, a restaurant, any number of construction companies, those kinds of things where there are ongoing obligations to people outside of the company that need to happen. Those types of companies, a big piece to that is that it has a value to it beyond just the assets it holds. It's got what we call, in the business realm, we call it a goodwill value. And so that's going to be the name of the company is worth something, right? And so in that case, we've got to have systems in place for how we're going to value what that's worth, how we're going to make sure that the estate gets paid or the trust gets paid that money that it's worth, so that then when we either sell it or move on from it, that we've actually got the liquidity available to do that. And so there's a lot of planning that goes in from the business side of things to make sure that we've a made a decision about what we're going to do in that situation, and B, that we've adequately funded it. So that's kind of a basic threshold that we just always have to figure out those answers to those questions. Then the next step past that is, okay, what is actually the succession plan? Are we eventually going to sell this? Do you have an exit strategy as an owner on when you're going to step away from this thing and cash it out and retire? And in those cases in particular, it's very important to be consulting with a lawyer who's familiar with doing this kind of stuff. There are a lot of ins and outs. There's a lot of different specific irrevocable trust structures that we use to maximize tax benefits and efficiency on that, along with just the practicality of like, how do you mechanically hand off control of a company when everybody's used to looking to you to make decisions? How do you walk through the steps to get the right person in place so that you can successfully hand it off and the business continue to grow and do well without you in the picture? And those are a whole host of issues that have to be addressed. There's employment agreements involved. There's trust planning. There's internal income shifting with the accountants have to be involved in that happens on that stuff. So all of those are very, very case by case, working with your whole team of professional advisors to get it done right. Mm-hmm. So that's a very, very 10,000 foot view of kind of what we're looking at there. I can't really get into specifics on it just because, like I said, it's very case by case. But it's just very, very important to be addressing those things and conscious of them on the front end, because things can fall apart very, very quickly if you haven't planned for it. And I know, Kathleen, one area that you care a good bit about, just because you deal in the elder care and the incapacity side, so you see it often, is how do we make sure that the business itself can keep going when something happens?
Yeah. So, and just to flesh out a little bit different things that can happen, it could be that a business owner is involved in a car accident, gets a bad diagnosis, becomes unable to manage their own affairs, right? So there is a transition period between managing your business and passing away, where there can be a significant period of time where you can't manage your business and you need someone able to do that. And even short gaps in a business where they don't have someone to govern and manage the business can be incredibly detrimental to the value that's been built by the business owner. And so this is why, kind of like what Erik was saying before, you want to have that talent development, right? You want to have people who can step in to take over those roles. And what's also really important, just on a basic level, is if you've got bank accounts and you have employees, you really should not be the only person with access to that bank account. You shouldn't be the only person who can write people's paychecks. You shouldn't be the only person who knows how to write the paychecks. You shouldn't be the only person who knows how to do at least the basic stuff that needs to be done to keep the business going for 5 to 10 days, right? Everything shouldn't come to a screeching halt if you are absent for even a short period of time like that. And so, access to bank accounts, knowing where the bank accounts are, knowing where checks are, knowing what software is used, being able to get into the software, very, very basic operations that you need to have another employee or trusted individual who can come in and take care of those things. Number one, just to make sure that your employees are taken care of and they can pay their bills. And number two, so that you don't lose the value that you've worked really hard to build as a business owner. And during COVID, unfortunately, we saw a couple examples of this. One time there was a gentleman who was the only person who did payroll, and he owned his business. It was very successful. And very quickly he ended up on a vent in the hospital, not with it enough to tell anybody anything. And because there was no planning and other people able to step in for him, it resulted in his family members having to go to the court, get an emergency conservatorship established, get those orders together, and then have access to information and resources that way. But even though it's an emergency conservatorship, if that happens to you on a Wednesday and payroll's due Friday, it's not going to happen in 3 days. Because even if you find a lawyer who can get you the emergency conservatorship that quickly, the bank is not going to respond that quickly. And so really having people, knowledgeable people in place to be able to handle things at least on an emergency basis is super, super important. And I know, Erik, you've got an example that is a little bit different from that. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, so first, I actually did want to just talk about this is not just something that happens occasionally. It happens a lot. It's an area, frankly, where I think as estate planners, we all can do a little bit better in making sure these businesses are addressed and these issues are addressed. It's a big enough issue that there are actually counties in Tennessee that have established special masters that literally step in conservatorships and estates and manage businesses. We actually had a change to our probate statute a couple years ago that we are now required, as part of our initial petition, to state whether there is a business in the estate, so that the court can immediately be aware that there could be other people being affected by this person's passing that are not in the family and may not even be a part of the proceeding directly, but that need to be addressed, right? And so it's an ongoing problem that is not being handled historically well. And so it's part of why we're talking about it today, is to make sure that we can impress on people, hey, this is a big deal. This is important to plan ahead for these things. So having processes in place, having people in place is just a huge, huge deal. Moving on to sort of my horror story. This actually happened in the last 2 weeks for me. I had a business owner who came in and had tried to DIY his own sort of business structure for his whole thing and setting everything up and planning everything out. And he, in the process, had used LegalZoom to try to help set some things up. Didn't understand exactly what it was doing, but he didn't know what he didn't know, and ended up missing a huge tax election that's going to mess with his entire taxes for the next 2 to 3 years, and put him in a spot where, from an estate planning perspective, I had to kind of say, hey, we got to shake this other stuff out first before we can even really adequately plan this thing. And it was all from the start of the business, how he set things up, that just made it so that we couldn't do things until we got the tax stuff sorted out. Which does bring us around to, when we start our business, there are a lot of things we can do to successfully set ourselves up for good estate planning as we form the company, things we can do. Kathleen, you mentioned having, the easy thing is, let's just move the business ownership into the trust. Well, what if the operating agreement doesn't say we can do that? What if the operating agreement specifically prohibits all transfers, right? Which is not uncommon, because it's one that business attorneys like to throw in there to make sure that people don't mess up their tax stuff. They prohibit all transfers, right? And I'm sure you've run into these where you've had to amend the operating agreement before you can create the trust.
Very,
right?
Very frequently. And my other favorite thing is when they do actually think a little bit about succession planning, they allow the business assets to be paid over to a spouse or to their probate estate. And we're in a situation where the client's trying to avoid probate, right? So even when there is some planning,
Right.
very rarely does it contemplate trusts. And then we're still going in and updating agreements, operating agreements, to allow for those types of transfers.
Right. And so when you first set up your company, if you do it with estate planning in mind, you can allow for that on the front end so that you don't have to circle back around and pay an attorney to basically do a once over on your operating agreement again and get things back in line. Another thing we have in Tennessee, I don't know what other states have, but we actually have a statute that says that we are allowed to basically create an option for a beneficiary designation, like on a life insurance policy. That can be a form that you fill out, and then if you change your mind, you can fill out a new one and cancel the old one and just kind of swap things out as you go. So that's one that we use quite often in our operating agreements when we're initially setting things up, is to say, hey, you don't know where you want it to go yet. I'm going to give you this flexible option to change it as you go. And then another piece that nobody likes to talk about, but is super important, is on the front end, we got to plan for how we are going to buy out interests of one member or another, or one shareholder or another, in the event of an untimely death. In that case, often the last thing the family wants to do is be dealing with a business and operating this thing and running it and doing all that stuff. And so, particularly when we have multiple members in a company, having funding through life insurance or different or some other or a reserve fund set aside within the company to pay that out is a huge help to that family. But when we're all excited about we're starting this new business and we're doing this thing, and then the lawyer goes, "Hey, what do you want to have happen if you die next year?"
Well, you're a joy kill lawyer.
It's kind of a bit of a I would say that's a bit of a buzzkill in that meeting, but it's a super important conversation to have, and also just talking through there's a ton of tax implications in exactly how that's structured, and pretty much any operating agreement or shareholder agreement you find out there is going to have some default language that's going to be, the business is going to buy it out, or the other members are going to buy it back and forth. That kind of, which one you want to do is heavily dependent on your business itself and what kind of business you're operating, and how much what the tax implications of one form of buyout or another are. And so that's just super important to talk about on the front end and make a decision for that. So one pet peeve I have is when people want to go and say, "Hey, I've got, the company bought me $5 million of life insurance. It's fine. Like, there'll be enough money." And I'm like, no, we need to have separate policies that do separate things, so that everything, because it also affects tax stuff for the company, it affects tax stuff for the other members. And if you're mixing and matching different tax treatments within one life insurance policy, it can be a huge problem. And so I always tell them, no, you're going to go get a separate buyout insurance policy that covers this specific thing. And we go do that. So that's kind of the big ones you can do on the front end to make sure that your estate planning goes smoothly later on. So do you have any other that you would add in there, Kathleen, as far as starting a business to set it up for success in an estate plan later?
We have these grand ideas and plans that we can implement, and then when people are out there on their own, sometimes I think they can think, "Oh, it's too much. I just go with whatever the form says." And I'm telling you, if there's one thing you take away from this and you're trying to do it yourself, make sure there's something that says what can happen with your ownership of the business at the time it is formed. Even if it's not perfect, it's better than nothing. So that would be my 2 cents for those out there trying to DIY it against our recommendations. I thought it might be fun to end on a little story. I heard that maybe you had a story involving some ice cream, maybe?
Yes. So this gets to the sort of transitions when somebody passes away unexpectedly. There was a Dairy Queen, and this is not one that I handled. It's one I've heard from another attorney who's actually the special master in one of those courts that have been set up here in Tennessee. There were the Dairy Queen that nobody realized that the business owner basically always just handled food inventory. Nobody realized that the food deliveries came at 5 a.m. on a Thursday. And so they literally had food trucks being turned around in their parking lot and leaving and not dropping off products, so that they ended up having no ice cream to sell at the Dairy Queen because the guy passed away and nobody knew that he passed away on like a Monday, and nobody knew that somebody needed to show up at 5 a.m. on a Thursday to open the door for the food delivery to be placed in the walk-in freezer. And so it just goes to the importance of having second in command named, and people knowing all the ins and outs of what you're doing at the business, even if they're not doing it for you all the time, but knowing that it's being done by somebody can be a huge thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, topics you'd like to see us address, please go ahead and drop that in the comments below. Otherwise, as we always say, remember, this is just legal information, not advice. And we look forward to seeing you guys next week.